So, Victoria Org is the legend that they have on this one. Victory of the Emperors. As you no doubt know with the reverses, multiple last letters indicate more than one individual. So here we have Victoria Org, so there are 3 Gs, which suggests there are 3 emperors, or you're doing a Popeye impersonation, depending on where you come from. So these are actually coins of Honorius and Arcadius. And there is a period when they are actually co-ruling with their father, and there are 3 emperors. I think that these coins are actually later than that, when their father has died. Honorius is in charge of the Western Empire, Arcadius is in charge of the Eastern Empire, but they are still continuing this sort of idea that there are 3. They're still honouring their dead father at this stage, so you've got that 3rd G still being included. So the vast majority of the coins, the reverses, show that. The next most common group is showing sort of 2 brother emperors seated side by side, holding the globe between them, with the sort of victory figure behind them. By this stage, of course, we are looking at an empire which is Christian. So we shouldn't really be seeing any of the pagan symbols, but victory is so heavily tied up in the iconography of these coins that Romans don't really want to stop using victory as a symbol. But of course, the great thing about victory is she's a winged goddess, so she just starts transforming into that angel figure, and that's what you're sort of seeing there, the angel sort of perched over the top of them. So it sort of works very well. It gives them that double meaning on these coins. So we've got around, I suppose, a dozen of those showing, in most cases, Arcadius and Honorius side by side on their dual thrones. There is a very few of this 3rd type, which I'm afraid we didn't have any clean examples, so excuse the mud, but these are the ones with the Concordia Org legend, and what you've actually got on these is well, I think it's Constantinople in this case. It's a personification of Constantinople, and she's sitting on a throne, holding a staff in one hand, the helmet on the head there, she's looking to your right, and she's got the drapery of the toga, of the folds of the outfit around her legs. And in this example, she's holding the shield with Vot V Molex on it. 5 great years, here's to another 5, or here's to 10 in total on the writing. We've got 2 or 3 of those, and then there is one slight variation, which is essentially the same coin, but with Constantinople holding a globe instead of the shield. So those are the reverse types. As for the obverse type, we have 5 emperors represented in all, and these are the examples we have. So the earliest one we have is Gration from, about 370-ish. Then we have Valentinian II and Theodosius, and then the latest 2 represented, Honorius and Arcadius. So we're going from 370s up into the end of the 4th century. You probably know that at this time we're dealing with the Tetrarchy, the system whereby the Roman Empire had been split into these eastern and western zones, and that you have a ruler in the east and a ruler in the west. And this was set up around AD 300 by Diocletian, and the idea was really advanced. He basically said, too big, we'll reorganise everything, we'll reform the coinage, we'll reform the military, we'll reform the whole political approach of the empire. We'll have an eastern zone, we'll have a western zone, we'll have an emperor in each half. They'll rule for 5 years, and they'll have a Caesar, they'll have a junior emperor who spends 5 years being the understudy, learns the job, and then the emperor stands aside and the Caesar takes over and rules for the next 5 years, and they in turn pick another Caesar to take over, which worked fine for Diocletian. He did his 5 years and then retired, but every other emperor who did their 5 years tended to think, quite like being emperor, and I don't think 5 years is really long enough to carry out all the things I need to get done. And of course, if they wanted to pick a Caesar, they all tended to pick their own family relations, so you get the sons being put through. It tends to lead to periods of civil war. By the period we're looking at, the sort of 360s, 370s, it had sort of settled down to a point where you tended to have 2 brothers. So you would have one brother ruling one side and one brother ruling the other side. And in fact, the first emperor that we have represented, Gration, is the son of Valentinian, and Valentinian is a military general who becomes emperor, and he rules with his brother Valens. Valentinian rules in the west, Valens rules in the east, and the two of them work side by side perfectly well. When Valentinian dies, his son Gration, who's become the Caesar in this zone, takes over, and he becomes emperor in the west, and he's still quite young. He rules for 2 or 3 years, and then his uncle Valens in the east is defeated in battle and killed, and so Gration needs to find a replacement. Now he has a younger brother. I'm sorry, that's just again the iconography to show you. Gration is interesting because he does actually sometimes appear in his sculpture with that sort of slightly floral beard around the edge, which is one of the few differences that you tend to see between the sculpture and the coins. I mean, sadly, because the coin is not terribly clean, we can't tell more of this. We only have one coin of Gration from this hoard, so of 159 coins, just this one, which is interesting because he's the earliest emperor represented. Now, Gratian's younger brother, Valentinian II, is still really too young to rule. He's only 9, 10, something like that at this time. But Gration has a successful general in the field. Oh, and this is, again, a bit more sculpture. That's Valentinian II as he'd look in slightly more 3D form. And basically, Gration has a successful general, Theodosius. So Gration awards Theodosius the eastern territories, the Eastern Empire, because there's a lot of trouble over there with the Goths. That's how the previous emperor's been killed in battle, and so he has to send somebody over who can do the job. Theodosius is a battle-hardened general who's proven successful, and it's either him or his 10-year-old brother, so there isn't really much alternative. Theodosius takes over the eastern territories and generally does a very fine job. In the west, things aren't so smooth, and there's Theodosius in his face-on format. Looks a bit miserable, but I assure you that's just the style. Gration in the west basically runs into trouble because he has a usurper in the form of Magnus Maximus, who is the general of the Roman troops in Britain. And Britain's always a troublesome province. They can never keep it completely occupied, so they always have to keep a number of legions in the country. And the problem with keeping legions in one place under one commander is they tend to get a bit bored of just whitewashing the rocks and beating up the locals, and every now and then they declare their general emperor instead. And sure enough, Magnus Maximus is declared emperor by his troops, crosses to the continent and starts a civil war with Gratian's forces in the Western Empire. Gration basically takes a hammering and is eventually defeated in battle and killed. And Magnus Maximus, the rebel general from Britain, takes over the Western Empire, but leaves Valentinian II the province of Italy for a while. Then he decides he quite wants that as well. So Magnus Maximus invades Italy, and Valentinian II, who's still quite young, flees into the eastern provinces to Theodosius. And Theodosius returns with an army, defeats Magnus Maximus, and puts Valentinian II back on the throne, where he remains for 9 more years. But he's never a strong leader. He's always under the control of his generals, and eventually he is basically knocked off by one of his generals, Arbogastes, I think his name is, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, but he's knocked off by his general, who replaces him with another emperor, a chap called Eugenius, who sometimes turns up in the coin hoards of this time. Sadly, we don't have any of his coins. Eugenius is then put on the throne by this Western general, but Theodosius isn't terribly happy with this, so for the second time Theodosius reinvades the western provinces with his army, defeats Eugenius in battle, and in AD 393 he becomes the last man to rule the whole of the Roman Empire on his own. And he briefly has that position because he actually dies within a few months, but he also basically splits the empire between his 2 sons, and those are Honorius and Arcadius. Now, we've got one coin of Gration, we've got 5 or 6, I think, of Valentinian II. We've got about 9 or 10 of Theodosius, and then the rest of them are these two. Most of them are Honorius, but we've got quite a lot of Arcadius. So the vast majority of the coins from this hoard are from these two guys, coins produced in their reign showing these two emperors ruling. They're two of the worst emperors the Roman Empire probably ever had. Arcadius is not really terribly well known for anything apart from just sort of dying quite young, having not done a great deal. He doesn't even die of anything impressive, he just sort of seems to fade away. Honorius in the West is largely known for being the emperor who is responsible for calling time on Britain as a province of the Roman Empire. So Honorius is the chap who sends the letter to Britain supposedly in AD 410 when troops have been withdrawn over the last few years to fight civil wars or shore up positions on the continent, and the people of Roman Britain write to the emperor saying, can we have some more troops? And Honorius sends a reply back saying, no, we don't, we need them all here, we can't leave you with any more, you'll just have to get on with it yourselves. And that's when the end of Roman Britain is treated as having occurred. So that's his big claim to fame. Although his only one other saving grace was, though he was not a military man himself, he did have a knack of picking quite good generals do his fighting for him, which is why he managed to sort of hang on in position for 30 odd years, but often more a figurehead than anything. So, as we say, that's Arcadius and Honorius on the back of those coins, side by side, reigning together.